All right, so a warm welcome again, and thank you, Eli Meixler from the FT, Juliana Liu and Kari Lindberg from Bloomberg, and Kosaku Narioka from the Wall Street Journal for being with us today, and thank you for explaining what your role consists in. And so now I'd like to ask you, and starting again from Eli, to tell us what excites you nowadays as you cover Asia's economies. Obviously, we are again in a situation where there's a lot of tensions, international tension, geopolitical tensions that are influencing economies. There is a tariff, of course. There is a preoccupying economic slowdown. So, Eli, how do you cover this, and what are the kind of stories you're working to cover this context?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting time to be covering Asian economies. I think it's an important one. As you say, there's a lot of, uncertainty, unpredictability, a lot of flux. And I don't think I would like to not think that the source of that unpredictability will be forever. I think that it will be transient, but I do think we're seeing a reorganization of trade and innovation-based supply chains that might live out in the consequences of sort of the Trump diplomatic format will reflect across this region for quite a ways. We're seeing that in the way that he's having an impact on American allies and trading partners like Japan and Korea, on the way some countries are trying to hedge their exposure, on the way companies are relocating and rethinking their supply chains and operations. We are seeing it in the way that he is turning against or putting pressure on longstanding American economic partners like India that have been cultivated for past administrations that have now come sort of under a spotlight that will have a massive impact, and it has an impact across American security relations as well across the region. It's forcing a lot of countries to rethink their partnerships. At the same time, I think that we're starting to see sort of structural concerns or slowdowns and crises of confidence in some developing economies in places like Indonesia and Thailand. We're seeing a bit of a crisis around slowing job growth in a lot of these places, particularly ones with young populations. That has a risk for political stability. As we saw major protests in Indonesia this year, we've seen them in Thailand in past years. I don't think it's too much of a hazard to say we'll probably see them again. That has an impact on regional political stability. That I think is an interesting story and one for us long to keep an eye on. And of course, we're seeing a major story continuing to emerge in the Chinese economy as they sort of as we move into the next 5-year plan, and they grapple with some of the major structural challenges there. But I might leave it there for some of the other panelists to talk about that more, if that's all right.
No, perfect. Thank you, Eli. That really sets a good view of the general landscape. So Juliana, you mentioned that as a columnist, you have a special position to cover issues where you bring your expertise, and you tend to pick up topics that I can illustrate like the bigger picture, just like the one you mentioned in your introduction. But so could you tell us a bit, the kind of stories you're focusing on, and give us a couple of examples and how that reflects the current states of Asia's economies?
Yeah, it's such a privilege to be, I think, in Hong Kong at this time, to be covering some of these issues. I've actually been doing it for a really, really long time. My first job was as a Reuters graduate trainee in Beijing, and it was more than 20 years ago. And these days, I spend a lot of time thinking about China's industrialization 2.0, China Speed 2.0, its two-track economy. Things have changed so incredibly much. And it's so incredibly exciting. I do cover the Chinese car industry a fair amount. I was just thinking back to the cars that were common in China in the 80s, 90s, and even in the first 10 years of this century. It was a Volkswagen Santana. You guys probably don't know do you guys know what I'm talking about? The classic boxy car, and that was the car where if you had one back in the 80s, 90s, you really had it made. And it was a joint venture. It was made in Shanghai, and now of course the world for Chinese cars is so incredibly different, right? And then you have Xiaomi making cars that the CEO of Ford, raves about. You have Chinese cars flooding the world with excess because there's too much, capacity at home. And then you have kind of the Chinese job market. This is the first generation of people who likely will not be better off than their parents. And what does that mean? And what the government does or doesn't do. Right now, it seems like they're pretty happy to just kind of let things let things happen, let the real estate collapse, clean itself up, and let these industrial giants eventually grow enough to, create a lot of jobs, which they're not really doing now. So many incredible themes around that. And I'm not even talking about the US-China trade war, or the trade truce, which may or may not last. And of course, all the other countries. I also cover a lot of Korea, a medium-sized country that is charting its own course, and so incredibly powerful in terms of its cultural exports. So it's a really, really exciting time.
Yeah, thank you, Juliana. And so the topics you mentioned, speaking about the car industry and the electric cars, that I think makes me think also of the technological dependency from various markets and the US, China, etc. So Kari, you are covering as part of your topics digital infrastructure, data. So can you explain us, how these topics for you are relevant and exciting, and as part as what you cover?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I like to think of my job as kind of covering it through sectors. I think it makes more sense. But I want to say one statistic that I think is really shocking. So the Asia as a region is expected to have the demand for kind of AI and data center needs grow about 32% year on year until I think roughly 2028. And so that outpaces the United States by roughly, minimum 10 percentage points. And so that should give you a sheer idea of what is the demand in the region, and why is that being buoyed? It's being buoyed by kind of the economies of Indonesia, of Malaysia, and also a lot of the demand is coming from China when they rerouted their demand because they are building all their data center infrastructure, but it's simply not enough, right? And you also have these tech giants trying to expand globally, and the first place they expanded was Southeast Asia. So that is why so much of the digital center infrastructure is being built primarily in Malaysia. Actually, I want to say Johor, which is just north of Singapore, and that's why the Singapore and Malaysian governments have recently enacted laws to facilitate that flow much more easily. And so that's why you're seeing, when you talk about bankers' pipelines, there's such a buildup of capital for demand just to finance these data centers, both from a CapEx perspective, which means kind of the amount of money that would need to run these centers, and also kind of the whole supply chain around it, right? Which includes the equipment, meaning kind of the GPUs and servers, as well as kind of the electricity and land that is used to build that whole ecosystem. So, I mean, it's a massive, massive endeavor, right? And I think the real issue here is in Asia, as is in the conversation with the US, is this an AI bubble? And I think that's really what bankers are really beginning to worry about, because their books are basically filled with all these data center deals. And I think it's important to understand why. Part of that comes from the fact that so much of these bankers' books had been filled with Chinese real estate. But since that bubble has kind of all but collapsed, essentially, they needed something to fill the gaps. And that's why data centers is kind of a great deal from that kind of banker's perspective. And so we'll be seeing a lot more demand kind of in the coming years. But it's also, I think the looming question we should be focusing on is how sustainable is it? And what does that kind of idea of sustainability around findings that look like in the future?
Yeah, and the energy that is required to make these data centers work, right? It's a huge issue as well.
No, I mean, it's tremendous. I mean, it's actually incredibly fascinating. I'm just looking at Malaysia alone, right? Especially when you map out where these assets are being kind of created, essentially. Some of it is actually, I've been told, using kind of reclamation, reclaimed land so that they can have enough space to build them. And there are huge ecological impacts for what this will mean, right? Not just in terms of kind of overcapacity in terms of your water supply, but also, where are you getting the land from and what does it do to the land, especially at a time when, we may be at point of no return to reach the 1.5 Celsius mark for kind of climate change.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kari. So Kosaku, you mostly cover corporates in Japan. And so could you give us an example of a few stories or that you're covering and that are affecting Japanese corporate or corporate operating in Japan? Yeah.
Oh, of course, happy to share. I mean, the Japanese companies are actually many sense global players in many of the important fields such as auto, AI. They are pretty much exposed to what is happening around the world. I mean, the SoftBank is a big shareholder in OpenAI. Toyota is the world's biggest automaker. So whatever happening in Asia and beyond, they are pretty much affected. And I mean, AI is interesting. I mean, a lot of people speculate whether this is like a boom or bubble. Let's see. Many people say now maybe still like we are still like building out data centers. So it's maybe too early to call it a bubble, but let's see. And the bubble will burst when everyone else buys the stocks. And it seems there are enough skepticism in the market, so it may not be like the end of the boom. In terms of like my coverage, more like a traditional coverage, I've been writing so much about the Japanese companies' investment in the U.S., which is often like obviously partly driven by U.S. tariff policy. But this is, I think, a bit more straightforward. I mean, they make some announcement and read out like some factories, plants, and investments. That okay. The thing I'm these days trying to pay more attention to is like the executives. They certainly discuss China's industrial policy. Then China tried to export a lot of things. I mean, there has been like a cutthroat competition in China's auto industry that seems to be spreading Southeast Asia. Maybe like Honda executive was talking about this like maybe just a couple of weeks ago at an earnings conference. They see existing players cutting price, offering more incentives to counter emerging rivals from China. So let's see what is going to happen. Maybe, I mean, this like an issue of like excess capacity in China spreading out other region is going to be very, very important theme in coming months. That's my, not my view, they talk about it. So that's what I'm paying attention to.
Thank you, Kosaku. Please, everyone, feel free to, if you want to ask questions, either to raise your hands or to write them in the chat. And then if you raise your hand or write in the chat, I will ask you to ask your question directly. But in the meantime, I will follow up with our panelists and ask them myself a few questions. So. Going back to Eli, I think obviously from a geopolitical and economic point of view, there's the question of the tariffs. So how do you see like different countries in Asia dealing with these issues, and do you see some countries faring better than others and being more able to reach deals that will secure them more stability than others?
Yeah, well, sure, yes, and it has been sort of the major story of this year. It's hard to say who's a winner from tariffs. I mean, it seems like maybe the American farmer might be if they use accumulated revenue from American consumers to pay them off for lost goods. There are certainly some losers, and I think the U.S. has a lot of leverage economically as an enormous consumer market and as sort of a main buyer of inputs from a lot of countries. And we've seen Trump really, in an unprecedented way, kind of take advantage of that position to the detriment of a lot of American trading partners, and I think ultimately to a lot of American consumers. And we've seen a sort of model emerge among some of the closest American trading partners, Japan, Korea. It seems like Taiwan is going to move along this path too, in which they will agree to a substantially lower tariff rate than initially threatened, though still certainly one that's higher than no one is happy about than previously, in exchange for enormous amounts of inbound investment. I think Japan and Korea are now at a 15% rate. Taiwan is currently at 20, and I think they're trying to move down to 15. They're still negotiating. We had a story, I think, on yesterday with a Taiwanese minister, excuse me, suggesting that there might be one in the works around assistance for helping develop the U.S. chip sector, which we sort of had a sense of. But a lot of it is, I think, sort of headline and announcement driven. There's been real disparity on either side between the U.S. and some of its Asian trading partners about what those investments will consist of. A lot of them might be sort of redefined or reallocated investments that were previously committed under the Biden administration, who unveiled enormous subsidies for and tax breaks for trading partners to invest in things like vehicle production and chip making and chemicals in the United States. Korea was at one point already one of the largest foreign investors in the United States. So there was no shortage of that. It seems like Taiwan is trying to redefine TSMC's enormous investments in Arizona as part of a trade deal, which would take up maybe half or more of what Taiwan is going to offer. And then there's a question of how sustainable this will be in the United States in terms of job creation, whether or not they'll need to import workers for it, which is what we saw at the Hyundai plant in Georgia. So there's still quite a lot to be worked out in making these things a success. Ultimately, I'm not quite a believer in whether or not this is an effective way to protect American industry, which is ostensibly the justification for it. I think it's incredibly disruptive, not least in India, which is currently facing a sort of a punitive tariff rate of 50%, which is insane and unsustainable, and also not really affecting, things like seafood and textiles and jewelry, like not industries that the United States really is competing with India against or is trying to support its own domestic production. It feels a little bit misaligned to me. Not that I'm a trade policy expert for the White House, but it seems a little bit misdirected. But we also see, I think, as a result of it, just because of that's what I'm looking for. So the difficulty of lost communication is that American diplomats in the region, it's really focused in the White House. It's really concentrated, and so we've heard from sort of American trade policy analysts and diplomats in the region is that they are not being communicated with well. And that they are being briefed by their other side, say in Korea or even in Japan, because the White House is not speaking to them. So they're getting it sort of third hand, which is an insane scenario. But it sort of reflects the Trump administration's disinterest in a broad and supported American diplomatic service. And I think as a result of that, we're seeing more not retrenchment, but an effort to focus on trade ties across the region. The United States is, I still think, a fairly irreplaceable economic and security partner, but we're seeing, among places like Japan and Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines, which is wild, even between Japan and Korea, efforts to knit closer security ties, to do more information and capacity sharing, to do more drills together, to sort of solidify lines of communication and cooperation across what's called the First Island chain around China. We're also seeing places like Australia, which is, wouldn't say entirely economically reliant on China, but it's by far its largest trading partner and buyer of resources, even as the United States remains its main security partner, focus more on trade across other potential partners in the region. So we're sort of seeing a bit of a reshifting of the landscape.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, how Australia has been like taking a stance and making bridges with China and against the US in this.
Yeah, I don't envy them. It's a very difficult position to be in. It's a challenging sort of conflict of priorities.
Absolutely. Maybe Juliana and Kari, could you maybe tell us the perspective of China, where we have seen the most spectacular, changes of position of the U.S. administration? Do you, I mean, what's your analysis about where that's going? Do you think that they will find a ground to reach a stable and win-win agreement, or might we see again some reversal of the position from the US?
Hey, Kari, I'm happy to jump in. I think the big winner of this trade war is China. At the beginning of this whole process, before I became a columnist, I wrote a piece for CNN where I was senior business editor about how China was armed and ready this time for this trade war, and it was a little bold at the time. At the time, it wasn't clear that this is the outcome that we would have. But it seemed pretty clear that China had learned a lot of the lessons from the first trade war with Trump. And it was a lot more ready this time. And things have played out in a way that I certainly didn't expect. I don't think China has actually lost anything of significance during this whole year. We journalists have been up all night, especially in Asia, writing about, what Trump is tweeting. It's been really mad. Back and forths, the drama. But China has played this extremely well. And, it's fought America on its own terms with the levers that it's, taken decades to develop, while still appearing to some eyes still restrained. So I think China has been the big winner. I do understand that the Trump administration, in terms of industrialization, reindustrialization in China, that's some reindustrialization in the US, that's something I'm going to be writing about as well. I absolutely understand the effort to have that happen, and it's not just the US either. It's other countries, Mexico, EU countries, are thinking strategies for that, and they're wise and smart to do so. But it's watching all this play out has been really interesting, and it's not over because the truce that was announced is only meant to be temporary.
Yeah, Kari, would you agree that China really came out as the winner from these tariff negotiations?
Yeah, I think they definitely are in a much stronger position, but I think what we should do is actually complicate the picture a little bit, right? I think in some ways, people like to classify things as winners and losers, but I think it's always, in some ways, that's an oversimplification, right? Because I think the trouble, at least for China in many ways, and I think in some ways you can make the argument with the US as well, is actually, well, from a foreign policy perspective, it was a clear win. I think what happens is when you have a growing disconnect between the levers that the government is trying to push and how that can starkly contrast with the realities of the country itself, right? And I think when you talk to, and I think Juliana mentioned, she mentioned how she did this review about this delivery driver who worked in China for like 20 years. I bought that book when I was in Japan, and I think it's a really good emanation of the worries that are happening, kind of festering domestically within China. And I think a lot of that can also be related to what I cover, which, is also a lot of the real estate market in China, which the real estate market still accounts for about a quarter of its economy. And there is no signs that that's anywhere close to recovery, because analysts have mentioned that they expect the downturn to last for at least 2 more years. So what does that actually mean? That means domestically, there's no signs that the economy has any signs of significantly recovering, right? So this is a massive drain. And I think that's really why you're seeing, while on the one hand, China may have gained a kind of foreign policy win against the US, they're also trying to hedge their bets and trying to make as many partners as possible. So I think what has actually been really fascinating while kind of this trade war has been playing out is actually China's relationship with Saudi Arabia. Because they have now been kind of a net exporter of China's exports to Saudi Arabia has reached essentially one of the highest points it's ever been this year, which is fascinating when you think about the amount of capital that is flowing between Chinese banks and Saudi Arabia. Chinese banks have been one of the major lenders of capital to Saudi Arabia. And why is that? It's also because Saudi is it's in the midst of trying to create its economic engine, right, through all its rebuilding. And so I think what you're seeing is really a political rejigging as well as alliances shift. And that is kind of showing you the different flows of money that are happening as well in the region, and also a realignment of what does Asia look like, right? Because now banks are now categorizing the Middle East as part of Asia, which is also very fascinating because our definitions of what is Asia means that can also change too.
That's amazing. That's quite fascinating as well, to follow the money and see where the money flows and what it tells us about international relationships and where the economy is moving. Kosaku, so where would you say Japan stands between the US and China? How do you see their balance, their interest between these two powers?
Oh, that's very, very interesting question. I wish I know the answers. But what I could say, well, maybe I should say like relation to tariffs and etc. I often emphasize, it is about the bringing manufacturing back to the States, but it is also about like sort of like closing, trade deficit, and maybe eventually like the U.S. National deficit. The U.S. military, the U.S. interest spending, government interest spending is already above their military budget. So, and they are still like helping the Ukraine against Russia. Then they try to maintain the power in Asia. Which is maybe a stretch. So I'm actually now very interested in knowing what would happen if like Ukraine war is going to be peace, somehow resolved. Maybe US interests come back to Asia more like closely, and whether this means strategically militarily different, from what we have seen over the past few months, we do not know, but maybe there may be some shifts. They may be US may be more aggressive. I should maybe like this. I guess it's fine to say things like this. Then Japan-China relations, we respect each other, and years ago, Abe-san formed like what they call like strategically like a mutual like a relationship, etc. And essentially, this means like we are not going to fight each other, and which has benefited the region, region stability. And I think none of like China has its like own issue at home. Then economically, Japan has its own interests, etc. So let's see how it plays out. Obviously, like over the past just like a week or two, there has been like some heightened tension politically between two countries, and I believe it hasn't ended. I mean, the general, the Consul General of Japan, based in Osaka, I have not heard what had happened to him. So if something happens, maybe another round of tensions, and some kind of diplomatic spots. So we will see, but and I think, in Japanese business community, there are certainly some more cautious. They are more cautious in expanding in China. I mean, building some manufacturing sites and selling to Chinese. I think they are more cautious. One, because politically it's becoming a bit more sensitive, and the second, China's economy itself. I mean, the consumers' buying power doesn't seem to be there. So in that sense, maybe they are more cautious in China's in expansion in China. So that's what I see these days. But let's see, this diplomatic issue, very sensitive, but I don't see it has been subsided. Maybe for now, seems to be subsided a little bit, but I'm not expecting this will be end, anytime soon. There may be some ongoing things, and if and when the European war ends, I want to know what will happen in this region too.
I see. Thank you, Kosaku. We precisely have a question about the relationship between China and Japan from Saravanan. Saravanan, would you like to ask your question directly to the panelists?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this great insightful meeting. I would like to ask, I was recently what the news, and I'm doing my internship in the Caravan magazine Delhi. So I was supposed to get information on why the China banned Japan seafood. Obviously, it's about the Japan stand on Taiwan. So any insight would be good.
I'm sorry, Saravanan, because the sound is not very good. We cannot hear you very well. So if you don't mind, I will just read out your questions since you sent it to the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Saravanan's question was about the fact that China recently held back the fish market trade from Japan in counter for the Japan stand on Taiwan. So is it a story that some of you have covered, and how do you analyze this diplomatic move?
If I may, or maybe I mean, there may be other people who are more qualified to speak, but my understanding was this was not this similar action from China took place maybe several years ago. Then over the maybe past year or so, there was some a relaxation of imports of Japanese fish products to China, but now China is again imposing restrictions. But my understanding was over when China essentially restricted imports from Japan. I mean fish products in Japan. Japan found alternative export markets such as maybe the United States or Taiwan. So the impact on Japan's fish industry as a result of this particular action may be relatively limited. So that was what's been said following the China's action.
Okay. Anyone else would like to speak about that? Yes, Eli?
Yeah, sure. No, I think Kosaku is correct. Absolutely. I mean, China had blocked imports of Japanese seafood after the release of wastewater from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, which was, to be cleared as safe by all relevant international authorities. And I don't know if some people here might be following. They've been testing imports in Hong Kong since then. They have yet to find a contaminated sample. So I'm glad that everyone's tax dollars here are going towards that. But I think it's a gestural move. It's sharply focused at one industry, but it feels feels like a little bit more sound and fury than a real disruptive force itself. I would agree with Kosaku on that. I think a much more damaging one would be the withdrawal of Chinese tourism and students in particular and property investment, if that proves to be a long-term trend, but to be seen.
Makes sense. Ken Moritsugu has a question for Juliana. Ken, would you like to ask your question directly?
Maybe you should just ask it because I'm on a train, so it's a little hard for me to talk.
Sure, no problem. So, so Ken just wrote that, Juliana, you mentioned China Speed 2.0. So Ken's question is, what is the 2.0 part of China Speed and how has it evolved or changed from China Speed 1.0?
Great question. So China's speed as a term, it's commonly used, has been commonly used both within China and outside. And it was initially used to refer to just the quick speed of the country's general economic development. And one way of kind of illustrating that is just anyone who's lived in China would know how quickly kind of buildings, roads, construction would go up, seemingly overnight. So that the term was used for decades to refer to that. But I think we have indeed seen a shift in the economy towards high-tech development. This is something that the central government has been really pushing for, most specifically 10 years ago, 2015. It's part of its Made in China 2025 program, which by most kind of standards has indeed been successful in getting kind of top kind of high-tech industries into kind of pole position in some areas, for example, EVs. And I think we generally use this term to talk about the high speed of innovation and the high kind of the quick speed of innovation and how quickly it's kind of reaching shores outside China. So it's still the same term, but we're just kind of applying it in a different way. Obviously, the previous real estate-driven economic model has gone bust, so we don't use it for that anymore. Like we're not talking about buildings going up overnight anymore because they're not. That's not happening.
Thank you, Juliana. So obviously this tech innovation for me it's kind of fascinating, and how different powers, obviously especially US and China, but are competing for also the commodities that are linked with this. The commodities, thinking about the rare earth and also technologies, thinking about the chips. So Kari, is that something that you follow closely? For example, these this flow and these exchanges and these mutual dependencies in terms of commodities, rare earth, and the chips, for example.
Yeah, sure. I think, I follow kind of chips quite closely, and I think, if what happened on Thursday or Friday, depending on what time zone you were, the US government, I think it came out that they had they've charged or they've arrested at least 4 individuals in connection with kind of a smuggling ring that they believe was trying to help circumvent sanctions and smuggle US American hardware into mainland China. And I think really this is the topic that is going to kind of continue and dominate, I think, political spheres for the next year or two, right? As long as the linchpin, in many ways, of, if I could be so bold, of tensions between US and China is fundamentally a tech war, essentially, right? Because that's how you kind of get you can get a leg up on each other. And both countries have essentially tied tech dominance to their national security, making it of utmost importance as they succeed. And if you look at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, by and large, the Chinese companies that have listed on Hong Kong are kind of Chinese tech companies. So that shows you kind of the degree of importance. But kind of going back to the idea of actual chips, and why this matters is because of all the data centers that are popping up in Southeast Asia. And I think not just Southeast Asia, but kind of Asia globally, right? Japan is also seeing a massive wave of data center build out. And really, I think that's really the struggle is how closely are people policing what types of chips are placed into those data centers and who's financing them, right? Because a lot of times what people don't realize is that there's quite a lot of American money that is help funding this. And a lot of the American money that is being funded through banks themselves is being used for companies that are actually now under investigation by the US government for potentially for allegedly helping China gain access to this restricted hardware. And so I think these are we're beginning to unravel this spool, and it will take, I would say, years to really do so. But it will be continually be kind of very politically and economically charged, because the reality of the matter is, why are you doing smuggling? One, it's because, well, you want access, but two, it's because of the money involved, right? There's so much money to be made in terms of the yield and the interest you can get on these chips alone, that if you can succeed, why would you stop? Right? And so I think as long as you have that type of incentive, it's going to be a fascinating story, and it'll be a persistent story as well, because the reality is every single tech giant, no matter what nationality you have an alliance to, you need to expand, and to do that you need massive amounts of computing power. And so it's really a question of when this story explodes and not if.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kari. That's really interesting, and I love the passion you put into explaining and describing the issue. So if participants have more questions, please, continue to ask the questions either by raising your hand, but I'm not sure I can see everyone. So the best is like in the chat box. And while we wait for some more questions, I actually would like to take a step back. And from the issues we've been discussing and that have been fascinating. So thank you again for that. And to ask you questions more about your career itinerary. And as I mentioned at the start of this session, part of our membership are students, others are young reporters. So some of them might be attracted by the career path of a business reporter, some others might not. But I'd be really interested to hear from you and each one of you, in a very, just like a few words, because we only have 5 minutes left, 6 minutes left, so that would be like a couple of minutes each. If you're, how did you, started to cover business, and what are the positive sides of you finding it and the challenges? So if we can go around the panel very quickly. Eli, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah, and I will try to be brief, mindful of time. The FT is the first business paper I've ever worked for, actually. I've worked for sort of general interest newspapers and magazines and websites prior to that, though I did some business coverage. But what I mean, it might be a truism, but I like fundamentally about business stories is that they're people stories, and that, it's what we say about corporate personhood. The great stories are ones that are aligned around people's incentives and opinions and impulses, in the way that we can tell human stories and stories of how people move through a period of time in a business or an economy story, and how it affects them. And this autobiography of a Chinese delivery driver sounds great. I'm going to be putting it on my reading list immediately. I think it's a sort of a perfect example of this kind of thing.
Excellent. Thanks, Eli. Juliana?
So I've been a business journalist for a really long time. My first job was as a graduate trainee at Reuters, superb program that I don't think fully exists in the same form. But essentially they took people who were fresh graduates and provided a year of training and a job. So it was amazing entry into the world of business journalism. I'm still doing it, clearly. And it's just so much fun. I think, it's one beat in journalism. There's lots of other ones. But for me, it's been endlessly fascinating. I like that it does ideally require a certain amount of technical knowledge, which of course we can all, learn on the job or in other ways. And it shapes our world very much in this day and age.
Maybe do you need to be good at math to be a business reporter?
No, you don't need to, you don't need to be like a Harvard or MIT PhD level, but you need to have basic math, yes. I hope most people, I hope most journalists, even if they're not business journalists, would have that.
I'm not sure about that. At least I don't have it. Kari, would you like to?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think I was always very interested in kind of the idea of following the money, and I think kind of just echoing what Juliana and Eli said, it's really, I think fundamentally it's about the people, and what does the people at that point in time say about the overall reality of the world, or rather their own reality of the world, and kind of the place in which they're situated in. And I think that's really what people are interested in, right? You go into journalism because maybe you want to tell those types of stories. At least I did, and I think that's the real joy.
Great, thank you. Kosaku?
Yeah, I think, I knew like a business or finance journalism may be important, interesting. When I was a student, I've been told if you want to be a journalist in Asia, you probably should be doing like a business or finance, because a lot of people want to do like geopolitics, but that or diplomacy, but that's that's a very high hurdle. I've been told. So I actually focused on like a writing, with even if it's like a city council meeting in a very like a small like a US city, I be writing about numbers. So then try to make make sense of these numbers for average audience. So that's what I started when I was in college, and I've been doing it since. Yeah, I'm with the journal now a decade and a half.
So it was a strategic choice, right?
Yeah,
was an opportunity there, right? Might have, just a last question for the panel before we close the session, and which will be, we are speaking a lot about how AI is transforming, well, many aspects of societies and many jobs, and obviously here, like I'm in Kuala Lumpur at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. And there's a lot of conversations about how AI is transforming journalism. So do you think, and obviously, we think that some part of this transformation is that it's going to cut down jobs. So do you think that that will affect business reporters more or less than other journalists?
Let me take a quick stab at that. So I do use AI for research. I think it's a very, very handy tool that not just journalists use for research. But AI is thankfully not quite good enough to replace columnists yet.
Yeah, and sorry, yeah, go ahead, Kari.
Maybe I could just supplement and say, I think sometimes the value in reporter is also who you know and who you speak to. And I think at the moment AI cannot, because it cannot filter out or be skeptical of what people tell you. So I think there's still the value in kind of being able to do the actual reporting yourself.
That's a very good point.
I'd absolutely second that. Yeah, there's no replacement for good reporting.
Excellent. Well, I think that's an excellent conclusion. So I'm going to thank you again, Eli, Juliana, Kari, Kosaku, for this really interesting conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I wish you a happy weekend, and we'll shortly post the video on the AAJA-Asia YouTube channel. So I'll send you the link, and you can send it to all your friends to see how impressive you were on this panel today. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.